Welcome back to the pod. It's Gabriel, and today we're talking with Dr. Angela Crawford, PhD, a psychologist, vegan educator, and award winning author. Angela, how's your month been going? I know you've been traveling a little bit. You just came back from Florida. How are things going your way?
Things are good. It's been busy, but all is well, and we're finally getting warm weather here in upstate New York.
Well, you mentioned 88 degrees. So I'm just wondering, are you actually in New York? Because that is amazing weather for New York.
It is. It was a lot cooler last week, and it may go down again. So it's very up and down these days, but
I hear you.
warm today.
Warm today. I'll take it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, talk to me a little bit about your background. You've been a psychologist for 25 years. You've probably seen a lot of things in your clinical practice, and I know now doing more education these days. I guess talk to me about kind of like what started you down the path of psychology and helping others.
Yeah. It's really interesting. When I went to college, I started as a journalism major. I'd always wanted to write, and I still love writing, but midway through college, I had taken some psychology classes, and something just happened that made me think this is really the direction I want to go. The kind of writing that interested me was more about people's, I guess, self growth and personal growth. And so I had really seen myself doing that kind of writing anyway. And so midway through my junior year in college, I switched to to psychology
Mhm.
and did an honors thesis and then went on for a PhD in clinical psychology. And I just found it fascinating how our minds work. And I think I was always working on myself, like a lot of us are maybe. I was always trying to
Sure.
improve myself and
Yeah.
just curious about, just how transformation and growth happens. And
Hmm.
on top of that, when I was a journalism major, I had to take a reporting class, which required me to go out and I seek out stories. And I just found I'm an introvert. My personality was more for people to come to me.
For sure.
So, so psychology actually worked well for me in that way that once I got through my training and started working in a therapy practice, people came to me and I got to learn about people just through that way. And I will say too, in psychology, I've always had an interest in health psychology and how our
Mm.
behaviors interconnect with, our psychological state and choices and all of that and how that affects our health.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
worked for a while in a pain management program and later went into a private practice. So I did that for many years. I actually just closed my practice a couple of years ago, but up till then, I for many years was working with people individually and in small groups on healing and overcoming trauma and stress and chronic pain and other issues.
Yeah. All very common concerns, unfortunately. Um,
Yeah.
and I think one thing that you mentioned about being more kind of like an introvert, I think that's something I deeply resonate with, especially, having to like work on the skill set of like speaking and like articulation and just like being more of a personable person out there. I mean, I definitely will be the first to just like kind of like retreat into my library and plenty of books here. I definitely can understand that, but also with the fascination with the mind, which is something that I've been deeply interested in for many years. And I think that with kind of like your background and obviously with the kind of like the emphasis on health psychology, it's very interesting because when it comes to health, we see that it's not just these kind of like isolated entities in health that work like separately by themselves. It's actually all interconnected, where we have kind of like, psychology, then we have kind of like health behaviors, then we kind of like have even like eating choices or exercise, things like that. So these things don't happen in silos.
Yeah. So true. And, I wish lifestyle medicine had been around when I first was early in my career because it would have been a perfect fit. But at the time, there was what was called health psychology, and so that was sort of a specialty area that I explored. But it's very interesting. I think I understood a lot about the connection between psychology and health, but nutrition was one area where I was really lacking for many years, both
Sure.
in my own, eating patterns and also in terms of what to encourage my clients because I think the messaging about nutrition is so confusing.
Oh my
it
gosh.
was it was sort of a blind spot for me, plus I had my own kind of addictions, if you will, being a chocoholic and liking comfort food.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that's something that you probably noticed over the years is that, there is definitely some sort of association between kind of like the food that we eat and then also kind of like our, you know, I don't know if this is the right way to describe it, but maybe psychological kind of like tendencies or idiosyncrasies. I mean, even things like, certain kind of like mental health conditions, like some of them, there's enough research to show like if you're eating a certain way, like you will experience certain symptoms. If you're eating a different way, you may not experience symptoms, which is amazing. Kind of like the
Yeah.
connections here.
Yeah, I really didn't early on make that connection. And, I think because it was a blind spot for me, I wasn't always so good at exploring it to help my clients earlier on. But later on, I started to realize it more. And as I made some changes, just even starting to eat more fruits and veggies and less
Hmm.
junk food,
Right.
and as I ate healthier, I had less of the cravings for the unhealthy foods. When I just started bringing healthy foods to work with me
Right.
and having them on hand so that they would be the first thing I grabbed instead of running to the convenience store to grab a candy bar or something, to fill that need for comfort. As I started doing that, I actually had more mood stability. I will say I later, have done a lot of research on that just because it's an area of interest. How does food connect with mental health? And I
Right.
found that there, like you said, there is that strong body of research that, for example, eating more fruits and veggies, even increasing it a little bit can make a difference in people's ratings of their mental health and emotional well-being. Yeah, so there's definitely some support that more plant foods with antioxidants
Hmm.
and the colors of the rainbow can really help boost our neurotransmitters and our gut microbiome, which helps our mental health. I am always cautious to say that it's not like it's the only answer. I don't
Hmm.
think I've known that many people where just simply changing their diet and not doing anything else for their well-being is the
Yeah.
sole answer for mental health, but I think it's, overlooked in our society where our eating patterns are so poor currently.
Right, right. And it's a good point, like you said, like it's multifactorial, right? It can have a tremendous, benefit, but at the same time, more often than not, there's usually a combination of factors that can help support kind of like, long term or, more stable mental health.
Exactly.
But
And it
go
oh,
ahead,
I was
please
I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna add, if someone's eating the standard American diet and maybe doing other things that are good, changing to eating more fruits and veggies and, less processed food, less inflammatory foods, which
Yes.
meat and dairy happen to have a lot of inflammatory compounds as do processed foods and sugars,
Right, right.
processed sugars. So if we're lessening that, we might see a big change.
Right? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that circling back, you mentioned earlier, two things that really stood out to me was the first one being that just adding in more fruits and vegetables, you started to notice a positive change, and that's so interesting because when you focus on just, what, how can I just add in more like positive, beneficial food without even restricting anything? It's like no,
Yeah.
I can still have the chocolate. Let me just add in more fruits and vegetables. And then by default, it's like, holy crap, like my cravings are
Yes.
starting to disappear. And then the
Yes.
second part, which you mentioned, was like basically priming or designing your environment, right? For health, right? Which reminds me of Berardi's law, which states like, what's around you, you'll eventually eat. Right. And
Yeah.
so like if you only have certain kind of foods around you, you're probably going to eat those foods, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. You said it perfectly.
Well, with regards to kind of like your, I guess, entry point into like plant-based nutrition and kind of like learning more about kind of like the realm of, I guess, nutrition on health, mental health, physical health, emotional well-being, where did that journey take you from there?
Yeah. Well, it started for me out of learning about workers in a meat processing plant, and it just got me thinking more just about the whole food process, how food comes to me, what happens, because a lot of the workers were in these horrific conditions where they had frequent injuries, and I'd never really thought much about it. And so as I thought more about the ethics of my food, it wasn't very long before I also got into the health aspects because I just started to read everything I could. And I learned about, for example, Dr. Dean Ornish's work about a
Mm,
plant based diet being able to reverse severe heart disease. And that was a something that runs in my family.
Mm.
So as I just went down the journey of just the very first day after I saw the program about the workers in the meat processing plant, I bought a plant-based cookbook and I made my first plant-based recipe that was fully, vegetarian. It was a lasagna that was delicious. It had red peppers, artichokes, and spinach in it.
So
And it
good.
was so good. And I had never, I didn't even have the pots and pans that were needed to make it. I had to go out and shop for them because I just wasn't a cook.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
just started me on this whole journey where I realized working with plants and new spices and ingredients that I'd never tried, it became an adventure.
Mm.
And I suddenly liked cooking. It was just a strange shift that suddenly happened. And then I wanted to learn more. Like that year, I bought a book about vegan nutrition so I could learn more about plant-based, foods and how they
Mhm.
help us, optimize our nutrition and how I'd make sure I was covering all my bases.
Of course.
Yeah, and then later went on to get the T. Colin Campbell Institute certificate because I was just so fascinated and
Mhm.
did some
Mhm.
training through Main Street Vegan Academy. I just kept wanting to learn more because, it was an ethical decision, but I think part of what made it so meaningful is that everything was interconnected, that my health was
Mhm.
also benefited, the planet was also benefited. It was just like it was like a
Everything.
win-win-win,
Right.
and I didn't know any other way of eating that had all those benefits. So I just kept wanting to learn more and teach people. So I've just incorporated a lot of training since then to try to be able to educate both myself and others.
Makes sense. And I guess
Yeah.
going down this rabbit hole, so to speak, like
Yeah.
what's what stood out to you the most in terms of kind of like some of the key benefits, whether it's for yourself, for your, the people that you support, patients, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think, one is, as I mentioned before, how confusing the nutrition information is out there. And
Mhm.
I think it's so tied to industry often that has the biggest voice trying to tell us what we should eat
Mm.
and kind of controlling some of the information that we're receiving. And that's part of why it's so confusing because T. Colin Campbell, who wrote the China study, he tried early on to get information out there about how people who shifted to plant-based eating could really reverse a lot of diseases,
Mhm.
even lessen their risk of cancer based on both lab research as well as more epidemiological research with people in China.
Right.
So learning that, I just realized, okay, I'm not really being given all the information about what science actually, says about this.
Right.
And it actually made a lot of sense once I understood it. Yes, eating whole plants, brings us all these antioxidants and fiber that is so
Mhm.
lacking. So I think it was just how simple it really is once I kind of put the pieces together and that it can help us emotionally, I think in many ways, as well as physically, that it helps us have those neurotransmitters that do boost our emotional well-being.
Mhm.
And I think for me, because it was also aligned with my values, there's also a piece that comes with that. So there were just
Mhm.
multiple emotional benefits that I hadn't expected.
Right, right. And well, I don't know. Maybe some people, anticipate this, but I mean, I didn't necessarily anticipate any of the things that you mentioned there, other than just like, oh, okay, maybe this will be a healthier way of just like eating and taking care of myself. And I had an ulterior motive. I had chronic autoimmune condition called psoriasis. I'm like, oh, maybe this will be the thing that will help. And it's like, it's so interesting the deeper you go into kind of like health and nutrition, like the more that you start to uncover for yourself, you start to realize like, wow, actually, you may come in with like one motivation and then it's like 50 other things just like kind of like unfold from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you're saying, it fits into the research where they find that people who have more than one motivation for why they're changing their lifestyle, especially
Mhm.
when it comes to the plant-based lifestyle, they're more likely to stick to it. And
Mm,
I think that part of that is that it's still sort of a minority lifestyle in our culture. It's still not the dominant way of eating.
for sure.
So
Yeah.
those of us who are eating plant-based and just trying to eat healthy in general, we're often
Yeah.
the minority at
Right.
at events that we're going to or in the restaurant that we're going to. So having
Yeah.
more than one reason, and continuing to build on your reasons can help you stay strong when like maybe your willpower is low on a certain day, but you remember like, oh, this actually helps the planet, or oh, I always feel better emotionally when I eat this way. Let's
Right.
let's do this so I don't go through that emotional down from eating something or physical down from eating something that isn't part of my plan.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so what you're saying is basically the more kind of like motivations or reasons that we have, the harder it is for us to kind of like maybe reverse that decision or changes.
Yes, we're more likely to be committed to stick to it through the ups and downs that do happen, you know.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Because I mean, there is social and emotional challenges that come up with adopting, a plant-based lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah, you might be the only one in your social circle unless you get your family to go along with you. You might have to struggle with, how do we set up the kitchen? How do we plan meals?
Right.
There's a lot of different things that can come up. How do I handle the holidays where suddenly I don't want to eat those same foods that perhaps my
Yeah.
family expects me to eat?
Right. 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 I mean, what have you found helpful? I guess it's been like almost a decade for you, right?
Yeah, I first became vegetarian
Mhm.
and tried to actually move pretty fully plant-based with that, but that was like 18, 19 years ago, and then 7 years ago became fully vegan.
Mhm.
And I will say becoming vegan in some ways was a little harder because people had gotten used to me not eating meat, but now I was adding
Mm.
in like, okay, I'm not eating dairy products, I'm not eating eggs. And I've tried to be also, I guess, a healthy plant-based eater as
Mhm.
well. So that adds in other things where maybe I'm not, even some of the vegan treats, I may not always want all of them if they
For
seem
sure.
super unhealthy. So
Right. Right.
yeah, I mean, now and then I splurge, but I don't
Yeah.
there's some of them that maybe I might still not want. And I've
Yeah.
also found on top of that, I feel better lessening my gluten. So then you have this other thing you're adding in. So suddenly everybody is just like, what do you eat? And so
Listen,
it
we
will.
we can hang out. I also we don't eat gluten and we're pretty like whole food plant based here.
Yes. But
We would enjoy a meal together.
so I will say that's awesome to hear. So it's not always easy. And some people are more, like we mentioned, extroverted. They don't mind just sharing whatever they think to anybody. But for me,
Sure.
I'm not like that. But I've gotten better. I sometimes have to just rehearse like what I'm going to say ahead of time or speak out to the host of an event ahead of time
Okay.
to say, hey, this is
Okay.
how I'm eating. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good idea rather than having to like right at the dinner table, make some elaborate explanation. It's often easier if you can approach people before an event and let them know. And I always think bringing great food with you is always an awesome way to handle events. I've started a thing where for my sisters-in-law, I cook a Sunday dinner often
This
on
is nice.
Sundays, and it lets them see like this is really good food
Yeah.
and
Well,
they look forward to it.
it lends to your idea where it's like if you bring the food, obviously it's going to be great food, but number two, you control the environment. You're like, I'm
Yes.
bringing the food, so
Yes,
it's
yes.
going to be on my terms.
Yes, there's definitely gonna be something that I can enjoy eating, and
Yeah.
hopefully others will too, and most of the time, they really do. In fact,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to be careful that it's not all eaten before you got a chance to have any.
You and my wife think exactly the same. Like this was her kind of like way of thinking like years ago when she
Yeah.
became vegan. She's like, "Okay, this is what I'm eating, so I guess I will create the meals and everyone can come." But then also to your point, she had to make sure she had enough for herself.
Yes, exactly.
I did mention to her a few times that I was like, and I think this might be my introvert coming out a little bit, to your point where it's like, okay, and you're saying set expectations. That's what I'm understanding. Like set expectations, maybe do it beforehand with the host or, the event or things like that. I kind of like also with my introvert coming out a little bit more in like private situations, I told Anna, I'm like, listen, so if the waiter's coming and I didn't set the expectation, I'm like, all right, I have allergies. I'm allergic to this.
Yes,
And then I'm like, they'll listen. When you say you're allergic, the people
yes,
listen. When you say you're
yes,
vegan, they're like, "Oh, it doesn't matter if it has fish oil or if it has some
Yes.
dairy on this." I'm like, "I'm just allergic."
Yeah, that's a great way. I think like whatever way works, we don't have to be hard on ourselves, whatever way we do it, just so that we're honoring what we need
Yeah.
ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm hearing here is there just has to be communication, just
Yeah.
some sort of articulation of like, hey, this is my values. This is what I allow coming into my
Yeah.
body, and that's it.
Yeah. And I guess it does get easier with time. I mean, I still, if I travel, I suddenly have to kind of revisit handling some of those situations when
Mm.
I haven't traveled in a while, but you just get better. And I just keep reminding myself why it matters to me. And so it's worth taking that extra effort to make sure it works out the way I need it to work out.
Yeah.
So,
No,
yeah.
absolutely. Well, coming back to psychology and kind of like the emphasis on kind of like self care, self awareness, like actually taking care of the person that we are. What are kind of like the core, I guess, health principles or health habits that you found helpful for people over the years?
Yeah. I think having a routine of some sort is really helpful. And so I can speak to some of the things that I personally use. And then I was always encouraging my clients to have different health self care practices. So, for one, I think how you start your day is a big influence on how the whole rest of the day goes.
Mm,
When I was younger, I used to struggle with like just rushing off to work and, kind of just being stressed because I didn't really start my day in a grounded way. And
right.
over the years, I learned that my day went a lot better if I had certain things in place. So often, nowadays, that's a time that I exercise because I think you exercise whenever it's gonna work for you, if it's after work or before work, but for me, I just over time found I was more likely to get it in if I did it earlier.
Mhm,
So that's one of the things, and then I'll have meditation time or journaling time, and it sorta depends. Sometimes I'm more into the meditation and other times I'm more into the journaling, sometimes I do both.
mhm,
But having a practice that really helps you feel grounded, connected, calm, intentional, what do I want my day to be like, and what am I hoping to accomplish today?
mhm.
Or what's the way I want to show up and kind of being grounded, and doing different exercises that help you to connect with you. For some people, it might be reading a devotional of
Right,
some sort. I've always loved journaling. Maybe that's because I always liked writing. So for me, sometimes just writing out both the challenges that I might be facing and then also what I wanna create. What am I moving towards today?
right,
So,
right. Yeah.
but those are some. There's so many that we could add in too, but including yourself and your circle of care. Often we're caring for everybody else around us, and we need to kind of remember time for things that help us feel grounded and connected and healthy.
Do you do you feel like there's a psychological reason why we tend to fall more into that pattern, even if maybe growing up, like we did take care of ourselves, and then that kind of like reverses over time as maybe more responsibilities pile on, or, but I mean, I guess what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would guess there's probably, depending on the person, there could be different reasons. I think those who are used to being very compassionate to others and caregivers, it's easy for us to just try to show up for everybody else and put ourselves on the back burner. And I think our society sort of reinforces that, by
Mm,
encouraging us to be busy all the time
mm,
and always to be sort of tuned outward instead of inward.
mm,
And I guess the important thing is it doesn't have to be an either or. You can be a caring person who is there for others, but if you don't include that self-care, you are more likely to burn out and
right.
not really be given from what really matters. It might just be more automatic.
Hmm.
So I think I was just thinking of the book Tiny Habits, which talks about how behavior change comes from motivation, ability, and prompts. And he
Okay.
says prompts are the most important. So, like, if we don't have prompts in our life, cues or
Hmm.
reminders that say, hey, take care of yourself, everybody else is giving us cues or reminders to do their
Right. They're
things.
saying, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
just like, I think that plays a role in it. Like, how many, how do we set up like you were mentioning earlier, and we talked about earlier, how are we setting up our environment to do the things that would help us care for ourselves. And if we aren't, that can just be so easily waylaid by us checking our phone
Mhm.
or the kids or our boss asking for something and just, doing what we're being asked to do versus being proactive, I guess.
Right, right. So I guess some sort of like trigger system where it's like, hey, it's time to take care of Angela or
Yes.
Gabriel or, like this is my time, even if
Yes.
it's for a couple minutes.
Exactly. And having it set in stone is important as any other thing on your agenda.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. And I think that's where kind of like um you go from that unconscious incompetence all the way to the unconscious competence. But it's like you gotta kind of suck at something before you can get
Yes.
good at it. And
Yes.
then you get good at it, and then it's like, oh, I don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah. It becomes just part of what you do. Now my days don't feel right if I don't have my way of starting the day.
Right. Right. Because you've done it. It's so integrated into who you are.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like I show up better for other people by taking that time than when I was just rushing into the day.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. It's kind of
Yeah.
like the old adage, right? You can't give from an empty cup, even though we're
Yes.
like, I'm
Yes.
trying, I'm trying to squeeze from the rock, right?
Yes, it's so true. And sometimes it takes, having sort of a burnout experience before we realize we have to just, I don't know, just take the time, make the effort, do what's hard at first until, like, as you just said, it becomes easier.
All right. So exercise, meditation, journaling. Those are the three things that I heard. All
Yeah.
three of them have like pretty, good amount of research like backing up the efficacy. I mean, probably meditation is probably one of the oldest practices, in human history for kind of like the efficacy, the results and things like that. But exercise as well, journaling. We know that, writing increases memory retention by like 50%. So it's like amazing practices. So starting with these three or any of these, even just one of them, it sounds like, would be a good place, to just kind of like, I guess, get more grounded, as you said.
Yeah, definitely. And all of them can help us with emotional processing as well. So different feelings that we've been maybe wrestling with, all of them are ways that we can help emotions work through our body and maybe get through to the other side to have a better way to cope with whatever situations are troubling us.
Well, that's a interesting topic there because a lot of us use things in food specifically, or even exercise. I know I used to work out years ago. When I first started working out, a lot of my motivation at the time was just kind of like as a way of just like expelling anger and just kind of like rage during that. And it's interesting that we can use things that are quote unquote kind of like healthy, right? And kind of like, you know, abuse them a little bit, so to speak. And same with nutrition, right? It's like, like food is a drug, right? Exercise is a drug, right? Like a lot of us self medicate with different kinds of foods. What I'm curious about is, I guess, from your experience working with, IFS, so that's internal family systems, the EMDR, this is kind of like more trauma based. Like, I guess, what have you found with kind of like reversing some of that conditioning within patients who maybe were doing or engaging with habits that maybe weren't so beneficial for their health?
Yeah. I guess you're speaking to when we take a habit or a behavior like eating or exercise as a way just to almost avoid actually dealing with the feelings or to,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
you know
exactly. Yeah, as a way as avoidance, maybe guilt, maybe self-sabotage, so to speak. I guess there could be
yeah.
a million different reasons, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, what you're saying is really interesting. And I mean, with exercise, it is complex because, taking a walk or a run can be a way that naturally things move through us. So that could be healthy. But yes, if you were using it as a way more to not feel or not deal with anything
Sure.
that was coming up, then that is less healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess internal family systems is kind of an interesting approach because it's a form of parts work and it's become increasingly popular. Like if you do a Google search, you'll find more about it these days because
Yeah.
a lot of people have made it very popular. But I always found it really interesting to work with myself and with clients with because I think all of us can identify that there are different parts of us that have different motivations and different
Mhm.
feelings and different desires. So there's the part of me that might be feeling sad. There's a part of me that doesn't feel I should feel sad or
Mm.
angry, whatever the emotion is.
Sure, sure.
There can be other parts of me that have different feelings about whatever the situation is that is leading to my sadness. And maybe some of it also traces back to something that happened to me in the past that is part of why I'm feeling this more intensely than I would otherwise. So there's a lot of complicated feelings that can be going on.
Mhm.
One simple way to use this concept of parts is just simply like if something is stressing you out, to write out what all the different parts of you are feeling and thinking about the situation. And it's sometimes just even that without having to go any deeper into the more formal work that someone might do with IFS.
Yeah.
Just naming it that a part of me is sad, a part of me is judging me for being sad, a part of me is angry about such
Mhm.
and such, a part of me feels this or that. You get clearer on what's going on inside and what fits with what you need right now. Because a lot of times there's just a lot of old stuff that's kind of getting triggered and
Right, right.
yeah, and that we don't necessarily need to act on. It just sort of separates things out a little bit. And then you can decide, is there an action I want to take now that I'm a little clearer on the different feelings I'm having about this?
Mhm.
Sometimes just acknowledging them is enough. It just sort of moves things through you. Other times you might need to kind of sort things out a little more and take some actions to address the situation. But you're less likely to just act on the first feeling that's coming up
Right.
or have to numb it or suppress it because, it's not all of you, whatever you're feeling. It's just a part of you.
Well, and I think that's where maybe the challenge comes up because mean, I don't know about you, but I know for myself, I was never taught about emotions,
Yes.
or even different parts about myself.
Yes.
I was just taught
Yes.
I'm Gabriel, I'm this
Yes.
entity, and that's it.
Yes.
I remember learning about kind of like emotions when I started going into Eastern psychology, and I'm like, oh, there's such a thing as like anger, compassion, like
Yes.
attachment. I'm like, what the heck? I'm not attached, and I'm like clinging on to
Yes.
every relationship in my
Yes.
life. I just
Yes.
I'm just well, just to back up for a second. So IFS, just as a kind of like a clear, simple definition, what is IFS specifically in terms of like the methodology?
Sure. It's stands for internal family systems. And so the doctor that created it, Dr. Richard Schwartz, he found when he was working with people with eating disorders, it became something he developed out of that work with people with different kinds of eating disorders that he was working with as a psychologist.
Hmm.
And basically, there are ways you can do it yourself. There's a few books out there that do help you to apply it in self therapy, but it also can help sometimes to work with a coach or a therapist that's trained in it because sometimes it's harder. It's hard to sometimes hold your own space in a way, but
Sure.
there are books. For example, Dr. Schwartz wrote one called No Bad Parts
Mm,
that I think is a sort of self-help kind of version of it. So that would be an example, but it basically involves a lot of times there's a trigger that you're starting with, a situation that you're upset about or that you're just having a repeated challenge with,
mm,
and you identify you might identify all the different parts like I just mentioned that might be being triggered, but usually then there's going to be one of them that has more energy attached to
okay.
it.
Okay.
So
And when
that
you
might
say
be
energy, you're talking about like emotion, like attached
yeah,
to it.
so it might
Okay.
be like that anger you were mentioning in
Okay.
your situation. So,
Gotcha.
okay, there's a strong feeling of anger, and then you go through a series of questions that help you connect with, like, where do I feel it in my body? And what is this anger wanting to say? And how is it showing up in my life? And it's almost like you're getting to know the anger, almost as if it were a separate person or part, You're
Right.
like, you can kind of ask questions like, what makes you feel this way? Or how long have you been with me?
Hmm.
And some of the sources on IFS would have a series of questions that you could kind of ask. You could journal about it if you were doing it yourself. But it sort of helps you, first of all, to separate from the part some so that you're not identified with your anger as it being you, but you could
Hmm.
be curious about it.
Makes
And
sense.
and as you do that, there's a series of ways you can interact that start to help calm down the energy of it and actually see maybe even what's beneath it. Maybe there's another feeling underneath it that, you haven't felt safe to express.
Mm,
So some of this can feel kind of deep, to talk about it in this way, but it's actually it can become pretty simple with just, reading a guide about it, like the book I mentioned,
sure.
or to see
Sure.
a coach or therapist with, help to get through it. And then you can kind of learn to do it yourself. But it's just a way of kind of dialoguing with yourself and
Mhm,
with parts of you.
mhm,
And it sort of helps separate out. There's a part of you that they call the self, and that's not even a part. That's like your core self that is creative, clear, calm, centered. All
mhm.
these, there's 7 or 8 C's, and I can't remember all of them right now, but they're all C words that kind of describe the you when you're at your center.
Right.
And you can reconnect with that center and have curiosity about the parts of you that are having different feelings.
Mhm.
And it just helps it to reach a state where you're not just feeling driven by these inner conflicts, but actually can have some wisdom then of, okay, a part of me is sad or a part of me is angry. And now that I've understood that better, I can have some other ways I can respond to this situation. It,
Makes
it kind of
sense.
separates you a little bit from the feelings so that they're not just driving you.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
well, there's a few things that I guess are coming up listening to this from your definition, which is very helpful, by the way. The first is kind of like there's hints of kind of like Jungian psychology with kind of like the parts. And
Yes.
when you say parts, I'm thinking like archetypes, right? Because
Hmm.
of the categorization of how Jung would call these different like parts of ourself. So that's very interesting. And then the other part, which is also very interesting because it reflects I guess also Jungian psychology, he had kind of like the idea of like the higher self or kind of like, this self that maybe wasn't caught up in the chaos. I don't know if this was from Taoist psychology or from Jung. I'm not quite sure, but there was a good analogy of kind of like the psyche being kind of like the house. And then inside the house, you have like all these crazy guests, like all throwing plates at each other and stuff and just going nuts in there. And then you have the host, which is kind of like your true self, right? And the host is
Yes.
calm, is grounded, is observing, is always neutral. And it's the job of the host to calm down all the unruly guests
Yes.
in the house of the
Yeah.
psyche.
Yeah. That describes it beautifully. Adding to what you're saying, one of the ideas in internal family system is we have different kinds of parts. So these guests in the house that you're describing, there are some that are what are called exiles, which are kind of our wounded parts from often from childhood that,
Okay.
we've kind of learned to like, we want to put that one in the closet. We don't want that part to come out.
Get in there.
And then we have 2 different kinds of protector parts. We have managers, which are the ones that we're gonna carry out in our daily life that just help us manage life, so that
Sure.
again, keep the exile down so we're not expressing anger every second of the day or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so managers serve a good function, but they can sometimes keep us also from dealing with certain things. And then there's
Right.
also what they call firefighter parts, which are the more extreme protectors that, like, okay, if all else fails, a firefighter could be like an addiction, for example. It's a way that we try to keep things suppressed. If the manager's not doing a good enough job, then the firefighter can come in and really suppress things in an extreme way.
Right.
So sometimes that's why, in psychology, things that seem like harmful behaviors, the therapist is trying to understand what function they serve because sometimes it has been serving a function and to just try to get rid of it without understanding how it's been trying to protect and then making it safe for that part that's been exiled to kind of start to come out. So it's kind of an interesting thought that sometimes things we do, there's a purpose behind it and it may not be serving us, but it may have been serving some function that we need to maybe understand before we can just get rid of it, quote unquote, or change it.
Is that like when it unravels then, when we actually go to the root cause and like understand like what is this actual
Yeah.
function that it's serving?
Yeah, and that's part of what IFS is trying to do. And I guess what the original, Dr. Schwartz was discovering with bulimia is like the binging or the purging or the restriction all served a purpose in this person's life where maybe it wasn't safe to feel certain feelings growing up.
Right.
Maybe a household that, there was abuse going on or other things that just didn't make it safe. And so, in this particular case, in the safety of therapy, they were able to kind of start to form a relationship with first the protectors. And then when the protectors felt safe enough to then kind of get to know the exiled parts
Yeah.
that they had to shut off earlier.
Right.
So it's about building safety. So sometimes it depends on what the issue is. A more extreme issue like addictions might need a therapist to kind of help hold that space. Some
Hmm.
of us have less extreme versions of that, or we just, have certain habits that we know are kind of detrimental, but we just keep doing them.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So just kind of being curious, like, what am I trying to protect or avoid with this? And, can I feel safe enough to kind of understand the feelings underneath and allow them? So
I get
IFS kind of gives an approach to help to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a great methodology because it gives you at least a structure to work
Uh-huh.
with because a lot of us are kind of like maybe, not so confident, on how to
Yes.
navigate, the realm of the psyche because again, this material is not taught. It's not like,
Yeah.
we aren't even given the skill sets on how to do this, but it sounds like it gives you a framework, so to speak,
Yes,
to
it
to start with.
does. Yes, and as you mentioned, even being able to name our feelings,
Hmm.
there's some I just created this, guide called the Vegan Emotional Resilience Toolkit, and one of the resources I share in it is the feelings wheel, which
Okay.
is if you just look up feelings wheel online, you'll find it has a big circle and it has, like, all these different feelings in it. So someone could look at that and be, like, able to identify their feelings better just by looking at that and getting language to even name some of what I'm feeling, as
Right.
you were mentioning earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like awareness, they say, is like the first
Yes.
step to change, right?
Yes. Yes. So just even being able to name your emotions, that helps diffuse them somewhat so that they don't have as much power. And it's not, again, that we're trying to get rid of them. We're more just being able to understand them and hold them and witness them, much as
Mhm.
you were describing, with more of a mindfulness, a groundedness that allows us to feel them but not be them. They're part of our experience, but they aren't who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the act of witnessing them without
Yes.
getting caught in them, so to speak.
Yes. And having compassion for them. All feelings serve a purpose, even the ones we don't like. They're there to either make us more aware of something or to let us know something that matters to us or an action we should take or just a situation we might need to be more aware of how it affects us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder. I think with something as, societally maybe not as acceptable as anger, right, or rage, so many of us, tend to struggle with those emotions because they weren't ever accepted,
Yes.
as children.
Yes.
But actually, maybe there was a reason why we experienced that as a child. Maybe somebody was hurting us. Maybe, we didn't like
Yes.
something growing up and we felt that anger. And then it's
Yeah.
like we shove it down because it's not acceptable, right? You're not a
Yes.
good boy or a good girl to be
Yes.
angry or screaming. But actually, part of you probably wanted to be upset because of something legitimate.
Yes. Yes. And often our parents didn't know how to help us with feelings because they didn't have that training either.
Right. Right.
So that there might not have been someone who could just help us be with that emotion and let it move through us. Because
Hmm.
one thing I find interesting is the word emotion has the word motion in it,
Yes.
so, that idea that it is meant to move through us when we can acknowledge it, have compassion for it, and understand it to some degree, it can often move through us. I think one tool, thinking of tools that help with emotions that I find really helpful, but not always easy, is just simply if you're feeling a strong emotion, notice where you feel it in your body, which is one of the steps in IFS, but this is just simpler.
Hmm.
Just notice where you feel it in your body and let go of all the dialogue about it for a moment, like even 2 or 3 moments, all that self talk that's going on. Like, I feel this way because of this, and your whole
Right.
story that you have about why you have the feeling and how justified it is and why it's happening. You can come back to that later, but just for 2 minutes, just simply feel it in your body and be aware of the physical sensations of it and breathe with it. A lot of times it just shifts because I read somewhere that the neurobiology of an emotion is normally 90 seconds
Really?
if we're
Wow.
not like prolonging it with our self-talk and our story. It's
Right,
really
like
meant to move.
feeding the fire. Yeah.
Exactly. It's really meant to move through us. And that's not pressing it down. It's like letting yourself feel it in your body and letting it guide you, but also just letting it move through you rather than continuing to rehash a story that keeps it activated.
Right. And it's interesting because in TCM they have this kind of like big system with kind of like the meridians and energy, chi and things like that. And they talk a lot about kind of like stagnant energy, and a lot of it being correlated with kind of like emotions and stagnant energy being kind of like the precursor to kind of like disease and
Yeah.
other kind of like chronic issues. It's interesting, right? Because
Yeah, it is.
it does have motion in the word. And in fact,
Mhm.
like E, like from a physics perspective, is energy. So it's energy
Mm.
in motion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is very interesting. And I guess so we have IFS. I guess as a quick like maybe we'll touch on this one real quick. For EMDR, what is specifically this kind of like method and how does this play into kind of like or how did it play into your practice?
Yeah. I worked for many years in a pain management program, and a lot of the people had injuries that were pretty traumatic. And some also had past histories of trauma too. And I found that talk therapy really could only go so far with some of that, we could work on changing thoughts through cognitive behavioral therapy and I could provide
Sure.
empathy but there were certain things they might have flashbacks or nervous system responses to certain triggers that talking about it did not change. And
Mm,
there are other therapies that are for trauma, but EMDR, I ended up witnessing a doctor model it at a conference I was at, and the change in the person was immediate and dramatic, and it just made me very intrigued. And
wow.
the idea with EMDR is that trauma is held in our body in a different way than normal memories. It doesn't seem to go as deeply into the hippocampus, which is where we build a narrative that helps us kind of make sense. Even though I was just talking about not hanging on to your story, we still need sometimes a narrative to make sense of what's
Sure.
happening. And
Okay.
what
Okay.
happens with trauma is sometimes it's stored in fragments where we couldn't make sense of it. It overwhelmed our nervous system. And so it's stored in pieces, like there might be images, there might be thoughts, there might be feelings, but they're not integrated. And so when something happens that reminds us of the trauma, it can just reactivate it. And we don't even know why sometimes. So, we were talking about anger. That can be a reason. Sometimes people might have anger that they don't understand. So sometimes it's activating an old trauma or memory that they're just not even conscious of. So EMDR, it was also discovered by a psychologist who she actually just happened to be walking one day and without thinking about it, she was moving her eyes back and forth while she was thinking about a kind of traumatic situation that had happened to her. And she found that as she did that, that the memory became less disturbing. And so she found that really interesting. And so she started studying it both with herself and then with people, and then finally did more research. And it's now that was 1987. It's a well studied modality at this point that's had lots of peer reviewed research. But basically, the idea is the bilateral eye movements that go back and forth. And they now also use other things like tappers that go back and forth or a headset with a tone that goes back and forth because sometimes people have a hard time with eye movements.
Mhm.
But it seems to replicate what REM sleep does, where basically the brain is integrating information. Because what they find is that a lot of times trauma is stored more in the right side of the brain where you don't have language to verbalize it. And then you have wisdom in different parts of your brain that isn't able to be accessed when you're being triggered by a trauma.
Okay. Okay. Like they go offline or
Sometimes people might shut down or they might react or there's different ways people respond to traumatic triggers, but it's just sort of um, not in their control. It's just sort of a reaction.
sure. Yeah.
So, so whether it be a big trauma like having a huge injury or abuse or
Mm,
something like that, or whether sometimes even small, what they call small T traumas, just things that left a lasting impact, someone that bullied us,
okay.
or so what EMDR does is basically this is something that has to be done with a therapist because you need the person to kind of hold the space for you. But
Mm,
but the therapist would guide the person. You decide on a goal. There's like maybe an issue that keeps just coming up again and again, or a trauma that keeps replaying. And then basically, with the therapist's guidance, you focus on certain key parts of a memory with either eye movements or tappers or something that helps that bilateral stimulation. And it seems to help things move through you so they're not just stuck. So things that you can't work through on your own,
mm,
EMDR is really amazing. Like I pretty much always saw some surprising result, from people using it. And I think the neatest thing is it fits with what we talked about with IFS and what you talked
right.
about Jung.
Yeah.
People ultimately connected with their inner wisdom.
Mhm. Mhm.
that ultimately they found insights about a situation that I would have never expected. So, like as a child, for example, maybe they had something happen and they made an interpretation about the event based on that. That really isn't what's true, but that's what made how they made sense of it. And EMDR seems to help your brain integrate things so that the wiser you
Mhm.
can really kind of come up with a new way of understanding the event. Like, I did my best, but I didn't have control over the
Mm.
situation, or whatever it is, where the person can now make peace with it and sort of be able to move forward without it kind of hijacking their nervous system over and over again.
This is amazing. This is
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
it is really amazing, and people who are interested in that kind of therapy, there's a website called the EMDR International Association, and there's a list of therapists who are trained in that there for people that are seeking that. But it is an amazing therapy for someone who's done like the talk therapy and just maybe is
Mhm.
stuck on either a recurrent issue or an actual PTSD kind of trauma, or
Mhm.
just anxiety about something that they know is just not realistic, but it just keeps coming up. It's very
Right.
helpful for those kinds of situations to kind of get to the root of them and have your brain reprocess so that you can now, when the trigger comes up, respond to it in a different way. It just sort of
Mm.
it loses its sort of emotional energy in a way and kind of lets
Yeah.
you
It
respond.
diffuses. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and I've
Right.
both experienced it as a recipient as well as when I was a therapist. It was one of my, favorite modalities when it was appropriate for people. When, it's kind of a power tool. You don't use it in every situation, but for certain things, it's incredibly helpful.
Like if I were to tell you, Angela, I do not want to go to the root cause of my anger and I want to stay stuck in trauma, do not take out your power tools on me.
Exactly, exactly.
I want to be a victim.
Yes, exactly. Yes, very true. Yeah, that could be true.
I mean, to kind of like play off of that, it is uncomfortable, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
actually we will need to actually kind of like, go in the cave, right? And it's
Yes,
going to be a little bit
exactly.
uncomfortable, while we go through that cave.
Yeah, and depending on what it is, yeah, some more than others. We always start with what's called resource strengthening, where we help the person, connect with their inner resources, which could be like a peaceful place,
Hmm.
supportive figures in their life. There's maybe spiritual kind of figures that can make them feel safe. And so they bring all that up first so that they know they have resources they can connect with.
Okay.
And there's different ways to approach it to make it a little more safe to face whatever the trauma is. Sometimes but, the neat thing is it tends to often it depends on what it is, but it can often move fairly quickly so that you're not in the horrible emotions for too long.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a nice thing about it. I will say for childhood trauma, it's not as simple as for a more recent trauma. So
Okay.
sometimes people might have an unrealistic expectation that if they had a lot of childhood trauma, that it'll just be a quick fix, and that it isn't for
Yeah.
that kind of thing. It can help, but it's if someone had more severe trauma in early childhood, they'll need other modalities as well to kind of address that. But it can be helpful for many things, and especially smaller T traumas or more recent traumas, it can really be pretty amazing.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And just as
Yeah.
a quick recap, EMDR stands for.
It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that was because when she started it, it was an eye movement based therapy, which there are some therapists that's what they still use. I ended up using the tappers a lot because I just found a lot of people wanted to close their eyes when they were processing.
Sure, sure.
And the tappers were like, kind of gave them something to hold on to. And they're just little machines that people can buy, the therapist buys, and the client holds on to them and they just pulse back and forth. And it's sort of reassuring and grounding at the same time. But I think the key thing they found is the bilateral stimulation, that both sides of the brain are kind of integrating the information.
Mm,
Even, there's some thought that that may be sometimes why taking a walk or a run, that could be one of the reasons it can sometimes help you move through
mm.
things.
Right, right.
Yeah, as you're kind of that bilateral stimulation.
Bilateral. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Well, I mean, I'm a tiny bit curious because you alluded to it. And we don't need to go too deep, but you did
Yes.
mention, so if somebody did have, I guess, like deeper conditioning or trauma or experiences, I mean, I guess what tools could they use to go deeper?
Um, are you referring to, like, for example, childhood traumas, like childhood abuse or
I guess, in general, more in general,
yeah,
it could be abuse. I guess abuse is a general term, right? Because it could be
yeah,
mental, emotional, physical,
yeah.
so many ways, right?
Yeah, I guess, when I was saying that, I was thinking of, as a therapist, you might see people with a range of different issues. And so
Mhm.
sometimes people had, not too bad a childhoods that gave them a pretty strong foundation that whatever traumas they've had in life, that they already have a pretty strong foundation. And then some people
Right.
just, just the way that unfortunately their parents were or key caregivers were, they didn't get that kind of support. And so they had trauma from very early on, just even from the people they most should have been able to trust. And so,
Right. Right.
I guess I think, depending on like how much resource support you had from caregivers or others growing up can make a difference in how much need you have for additional things. And so when I was working with clients, if someone had had a huge amount of childhood trauma and abuse and that sort of thing, they would need a lot more like relationship building and support in the therapy
Mm.
relationship to just even feel safe to go there to
Mhm.
some of the more traumatic experiences. It wasn't just something on the first time we met that we could go work on a
Yeah.
trauma. You know, it was
Right.
sort of like we would build a relationship. It was, often with people that have had a really difficult past, the relationship with the therapist is as important as any like technique the therapist might ever use in some ways,
That makes
because
sense.
they might not have had someone they could trust or feel safe with. So,
Right.
so
Right.
sometimes there's just building safety and trust with somebody. But, there might be other people that their history isn't that extreme, as far as what happened, but they still might be struggling. And so you might need a range of different things of just some trauma work, but also a lot of work on building your inner resources, like believing in yourself more, realizing that you have some qualities in you that you can strengthen because what our brain focuses on expands and we might
Yes.
not have
Yes.
really paid attention to where our resources are, like the times we're really good at something or the time we overcame something. So, and actually EMDR has a kind of a sort of a sub therapy that is called tapping in or tapping in your resources, where you might actually come think about times when you overcame something. Like maybe you're having a surgery coming up, before you go in that surgery, you might envision times that you handled past procedures really well. And then like do a little bit of bilateral tapping just on your own legs or on your own arms like 6 to 12 times, and that strengthens the connection with those memories of resilience. So that's a neat way you can actually use something that's related to EMDR where you're not going into the trauma processing,
Sure. Sure.
but you're just strengthening your resources because by bringing them up with imagery and then tapping back and forth 6 to 12 times, it seems to help the brain integrate those resources more strongly. And so then when you go in for that procedure, you have that stronger memory. So you could apply that for a lot of things, just things that you're a little anxious about or,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, just things, maybe, you've heard about like with people who are athletes envisioning their
Yes.
performance, so it's sort
My
of
gosh.
like that, you could
Okay.
envision something that you want to create and strengthen and then tap it in by going back and forth.
Is this similar to like emotional freedom technique with kind of like the tapping?
There is some similarities. The thing with emotional freedom technique, EFT, is that it's tapping on different acupressure sites, and
Mhm.
I do love that technique because I think that's one that, people can learn to use without needing a therapist. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of great videos out there for how you can use that by saying a series of phrases while you're tapping on these different acupressure points that the video would guide you to. It's kind of hard to remember off the top of your head, but it's like tapping
Yep,
on the
there's a
side of your
few.
hand and
Yeah. On
thing,
the yep, yeah. I did,
sides and
Dr. Chris Walton's, Gamma Mindset, so he had a whole, like, EFT, which
yeah.
was
And then
absolutely amazing.
now
Yeah.
sometimes like, so the thing that's different is EMDR is a bilateral stimulation, so it's stimulating both sides of the brain, whereas EFT is more about stimulating your acupressure points. But I think in some
Okay.
ways there can be similar results.
Mhm.
I guess the theory with EFT, emotional freedom technique, is that it's helping your nervous system be calmer as you're facing something that might be stressful or anxiety provoking. And it sort of helps you integrate and kind of view it differently in a way.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of what they can do. It's just a little different modality and a little different maybe mechanism underneath, but I think the end result can be somewhat similar.
Mm. Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah,
It's kind of like, a different tool in the carpenter's, like, toolbox.
exactly. Yes. And so I definitely think that's a great tool to have. And then just even simpler things like breathing techniques and stuff like
Mhm.
that, just to calm your nervous system and bring yourself back into a calmer place.
Yeah, yeah. It's like we did like a full circle there. We started with,
Yes.
the exercise and meditation and journaling, and then there's obviously more advanced techniques. We have
Yes.
EMDR, you have the IFS, and it's, I think, well, I guess looking at the current state of modern society, I mean, we don't really have, I would say, such a integrated society where we have like healthy, emotionally grounded human beings who are calm, peaceful. I don't think that's like the common, at least not in the States.
Yes.
I mean, would you
Yes.
say that it's a big part of this is because of just the lack of education and the lack of, I guess, skill training and a lot of the topics we've been discussing?
Yeah, it seems like a lack of education, a lack of skill training, as you're saying, and it seems like the way culture is set up, it's not really set up to value these types of self-compassionate self-care practices, it's just set up for
Mhm.
us to be busy, 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 just kind of suck it up. Don't, emotions
Yeah.
should be pushed down. It seems like, and I think there's ups and downs. There's times where emotional intelligence and emotional self care is more valued. And we seem to be in a time right now where I feel like it's less valued.
Right.
But I think it's got to come back around to matter because we're not going to do well if
Mhm.
we don't start to include tools and then also teach our children these tools so that they can know how to regulate their nervous system, how to
Right.
navigate emotions, how to handle different things that come up for them, how to socially connect with others because we're social creatures. We do need
Mhm.
support.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I think things aren't really set up to prioritize this, and that's unfortunate. I mean, it'd be nice if
Mhm.
schools were given more resources to prioritize this
Yeah.
but I guess we can just in the meantime become more self-aware and know what's the kind of life I want to create and what's the kind of
Yes.
world I want to help contribute to.
Right, right. And I think you're right. I think that on one side, I mean, it would be tremendously helpful to have kind of like external education systems, supporting this. But then it's kind of like at the same time, like you also said, it's like if it's meant to be, it's up to me, right? Like if I want to have this, personal change or, create a certain result, like I got to take ownership,
Yeah.
even if it's uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and I guess coming back to nutrition, exercise, health, and now we have kind of like underneath all that, you have kind of like the psychological like base, which is like always there. It's always affecting all of these external things. So, am I understanding that if we work like from inside out, like we can impact everything positively? If we address the psychological, the exercise, the nutrition, the health behaviors, like all this is going to work in tandem together.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that, that it is interconnected. And if we're neglecting understanding our psychology and tending to our psychological well being, it's going to make it harder for the other things to be in as good a place. And if we are including our self care and self awareness, it's going to help all the things you mentioned.
Right. Because it's all connected.
Yes.
Well, talk to me a little bit about your book. You have a course. I think you mentioned you have a new ebook coming out as well. Tell me a little bit about kind of like some of your recent work and projects.
Sure. So I had long had a dream since I was a journalism major of writing a book, and it finally came to be. It's called The Vegan Transformation: A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. And I'd written that because I was curious about the psychological and spiritual benefits of a plant-based vegan lifestyle. I'd seen a lot about the health benefits. I'd seen a lot about the ethical reasons, but
Hmm.
I hadn't seen as much about how are we affected emotionally, spiritually, psychologically as we go on a path to live a plant-powered vegan lifestyle. So I
Mhm.
surveyed and interviewed vegans for the book, and I think about 350 filled out my survey, and then I interviewed 75 in depth. And it was just looking more at how has your life changed emotionally, socially, spiritually as
Mm.
you've gone on this journey. And yeah, it was really neat to see, and I did the research a few years ago. It seemed like in some ways things felt a little more positive then than sometimes sometimes I feel that they are at the moment. But
Yeah.
regardless, people shared some really cool changes that unfolded in their life as they moved into this plant-based vegan path where they started to, one, they felt like they were truly aligning with their values and there was kind of a peace they found with that. And then sometimes there were unexpected health empowerment where, I always thought I had to take medications or just do what my doctor said,
Right,
but they
right.
never told me that nutrition could actually heal me. And many of my people had some really dramatic healings that happened that just made them feel so much more empowered because not only does being in better health just help you feel better, it just changes your life in terms of
Yeah.
what you can do and what you can enjoy.
Right, right.
And there were spiritual changes where people felt like eating lighter on the food chain actually was beneficial to them spiritually, which, I hadn't fully expected that.
Mhm.
That one was a surprise. So it was a really inspiring. And so the book shares stories of people, as well as the research kind of that backs up why these different things that came through the interviews, why they matter, and how
Mhm.
can we also apply them in our own life. So some
Mm.
exercises and reflections for the reader to take the different principles that came through my research and see how it fits for their life. How does the spiritual path and eating plant-based fit for them? How did they empower their health? How do they connect with their values? Meaning and purpose was another one.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, so just kind of some of the key findings related to positive psychology and how we live a better life, really.
Makes sense. And I think it's so helpful because it helps illuminate kind of like some of these like maybe not so commonly discussed aspects of kind of like just changing like your nutrition habits. And it's like a waterfall effect where it's
Yeah,
like everything else, it's like it's not just one thing, it's like boom, 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 boom. It's like, wow, this is amazing. It's impacting kind of like my physical health, yes, potentially my mental health, my emotional health, relationship health, even the relationships you have with your family, your children. I can imagine probably, there's certain challenges, constraints, things that come up obviously, in social environments, but it's kind of like we're so adaptable as humans. I think that's the
yeah,
most amazing thing about humans is that we're so adaptable.
yes, yeah. And so, yes, and more recently, I was working on an ebook that's a shorter ebook that's about emotional resilience for people on the vegan path. Because I think since writing my book this last couple of years, there's been a lot of just mixed messaging about things like nutrition. And it just seems like,
Mm,
in 2019, the year I first transitioned from vegetarian to vegan, it was called the year of the vegan. There was a lot of positivity about plant-based eating and plant-based products and, the vegan lifestyle. And in the last year or two, sometimes on social media and things like that, there's just more negative messaging out there.
mhm.
I just became aware of that like in the last year or so, just as I was out there more promoting my book. I was just like, oh, things feel a little different. So there can be ups and downs, when you're on this path, where times where you might feel more accepted and supported, and then times when society or your loved ones might be more questioning you or
Mhm,
giving you a hard time about your lifestyle. And so that can lead to emotional stress. And I just think
mhm.
as vegans and plant-based eaters, and just people that want to be on a path to live a better life, we need to have emotional resilience to stay the course so that we know kind of how to navigate the ups and downs. So I think, it's just important to have tools. And some of the things we talked about today are some of those kinds of
Yeah,
tools. And having a strong why, I think, is another tool that maybe I didn't touch on so much today, but, obviously why we're doing something can be a big foundation to help us ride out, the tough times.
right, right. And I think I mean, there's so much research on kind of like the benefits of having like more of a deeper intrinsic motivation versus just,
Uh,
extrinsic motivation. I just want to drop a few pounds or, I want to look good for the beach versus like, hey, I want to create, generational health for my kids,
yes.
or I want to, live to 100 so I can see my grandkids grow up or so, or, whatever the
Yes,
the reason is.
yes.
It's going a little bit deeper, right?
Yes.
Peeling back the layers, which is I feel like we dove so deep into that. It's like actually like pulling back the layers and coming back to your center, coming back to
Yeah.
that kind of like that true self, true nature, and just kind of like seeing things more clearly,
Yes.
objectively from there.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Well, you have a course. I believe it's a course or it's your work in terms of kind of like helping people transition more towards kind of like plant-based eating, more towards a vegan lifestyle. I know some of your work is, I guess, based off of education and supporting others in their health journey. Could you tell me a little bit about that? And then, like, how can people contact you? How can they reach out to you?
Sure. Yeah, I have a few different things. So one thing from time to time, I do teach food for life classes. That's a program from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And that's really for people who are plant curious, who want to know actually how do I implement plant-based eating in terms of cooking and
Hmm.
understanding some of the basics of nutrition. So on my website, I have a thing for plant-based cooking classes, which are the food for life classes. So sometimes I have those. I don't have an immediate one coming up, but I will again in the not too distant future. I have something called the Vegan Transition Certification Program, which is for people who are either coaches or just curious to know more like how they themselves can transition to a vegan lifestyle. It's on Udemy and it's listed on my website too under services. So
Okay. Okay.
it kind of goes deep into like both understanding the nutritional parts. It was taught with a co-teacher named
Hmm.
Stephanie Harder. So she gets into some of the nutritional pieces. I get into the emotional and social aspects of transitioning your lifestyle and also just communication, things like that.
Hmm.
So it's a kind of comprehensive course. And then one final thing, I guess, is in the near future, I'm going to be doing a vegan resilience intensive, which is sort of for people who are already vegan, but just kind of struggling with the social and emotional aspects of being plant based in a non plant based world. So that's coming up
Yeah.
soon and will be listed on my website as well. So, and that's AngelaCrawfordPhD.com.
Phenomenal. Phenomenal. And we'll make sure we get all the links. I know I'll get your socials in there. We'll get the website, your book. We'll put that all in the show notes. But I think it's so refreshing to hear that, it's possible to not only, thrive, using a plant-based diet, vegan lifestyle, but at the same time, like you can actually be resilient. Like you can actually be like very, very strong and empowering, to
Yes.
other people at the same time.
Yes, exactly.
I guess if we were to make it easy for somebody, like for like an action step, like one or two action steps from what we talked about today, from listening to our conversation, I know we went a little bit deeper, into kind of like some of the subterranean parts of the psyche, but like if someone were to take like one or two action steps, like where could they start to like create better mental health or better relationship with themselves?
Yeah, I think choosing a practice that you want to do on a regular basis that is a foundational piece. And so we're all different. So you might not be into journaling, but maybe you've always wanted to try meditation. I think having something that's a practice and just starting with one thing, because I think when you do it regularly, it makes it easier than to add in other things. I would say too, if it sort of depends on where you're at. If you already have some practices, add something else in, just to see
Hmm.
what you resonate with. And even something very simple could be one type of breathing that I like for calming the nervous system is 4-7-8 breathing, where you breathe in for
Okay.
4 counts, you pause and hold it for 7, and then breathe out for 8
Mm,
through your mouth. So you breathe in for 4 counts through your nose, pause and hold it for 7, then breathe out slowly through your mouth for 8, and just do that for 4 breaths. There's
mm,
something about the longer exhalation that helps your parasympathetic nervous system kick in. And so doing that like once in the morning and once at night for four breaths,
mm,
it can just kind of help reset your nervous system. And then those times when you need it, you
mhm,
can draw on it then too. But that's
mhm.
just like something very simple and quick that can kind of
Right.
help, in the moment. But it's a path. And I think just even saying it matters to you and taking an action, any action can help.
Just choosing something.
Yes.
Whether it's meditation, breathing, journaling, just something
Yes.
that like, okay, this resonates with me and like I could see myself committing to this.
Yes, exactly. Try it for a few weeks, 3 to 6 weeks, see how it goes. And then
Mhm.
and
then
go
just
from there.
reassess. Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. Makes sense. And I guess what would you say is your best advice to somebody who they want to change their health behaviors, but they just keep struggling with self sabotage? Is it just like I need to spend more time with myself? I need to like just reflect. I need what's I guess
Hmm.
the pathway for them?
Yeah. That's a tough one. But I guess that could be a time where you'd be curious, like, what is this part of me that's wanting to self sabotage? What's their motivation? That
Yeah.
could be, that could be a thing of journaling out, like, what is this part of me afraid of? Or what is this part of me trying to avoid?
Right.
That could be one way. It could be just having compassion for that part, but just saying, I'm going to take one small baby step that's in the direction I want to go. And let's just see how that feels
Yeah.
rather than expect a big change.
Hmm.
Let's just
Hmm.
start with something small that's in the direction I want to head and see how it feels. So
Makes
it
sense.
can be complicated when something is getting in the way, trying to figure out how to first get past
Right.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because you kind of like you feel like you're hitting a wall or something. But what you're saying is actually curiosity and self compassion. Like that, these
Yes.
are prerequisites. Like I guess it's basically
Yes.
impossible to change if you're not curious and like you don't
Yes.
care, you know?
Yes, exactly. You named it perfectly. This the curiosity and self-compassion and being open to just taking a small step forward to see how that shifts things.
Mhm, mhm. No, that makes sense. Yeah, very helpful, very helpful. Because I think we can get, deep into psychological topics, nutrition and things like that, but, at the end of the day, like, change comes from action. It comes from actually taking consistent action, doing the right things in our health, and being patient, compassionate with ourselves to know that, change takes time, and sometimes, things are gonna come up, from the ocean of unconscious, and, it's our responsibility to face it, and if we're not ready to face it, like, there's a time and a place. There's
Yes.
techniques that we can use. There's coaches, therapists that we can reach out to, we can get support from.
Yes, definitely. Like if you're feeling really stuck, just even sometimes a short time with somebody else can help you see outside of what you can't see. You
Mm,
know, a few sessions with a coach or, something that helps you get that other perspective.
yeah. No, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Makes sense. Well, Angela, I'm very grateful for your time today. Is there anything else that you'd find helpful, useful, anything you just feel called to share, or um, do you feel we've covered everything today?
Well, we covered a lot. Yeah, I just think, you are worth it, whatever changes you're trying to make in your life for the better, for you, for your loved ones. Just keep remembering why it's worth it to you and that you are worth it
Mm,
and keep taking the next step. I think there's just something about when we keep moving forward, we get clearer on what we need to do next. But
mhm.
as you just mentioned, it takes sometimes getting in action and starting somewhere and just staying connected with why it matters to you.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any action is better than no action, right?
Yeah.
Even a bad plan is better than no plan at all.
Yeah. So you learn something from it
All right.
and bringing that curiosity in, what do I learn from this and what would I do different next time?
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing, Angela. I appreciate you. Thank you again for the time,
Mhm.
for the insights. I think this was a tremendous help, and I think it'll be a very, very valuable resource for everybody who listens in.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Angela. We'll talk soon.
Okay.